Now, for our last segment on the Old Testament, I want to jump into one prophetic book, perhaps the most important prophetic book in the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah. Now, as we've seen, the covenant that God has made with David seems to be hanging in the balances by the end of the book of Kings, right? There is no Davidic king, there is no Davidic throne, there is no Davidic kingdom, right? The people are in exile. Now, when you come into the book of Isaiah, that is about to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But Isaiah is going to look beyond the exile frequently throughout the book to what God would do one day on the other side. That exile would not be the end of the story. But as you come into the book of Isaiah, especially at the beginning, like Isaiah chapter 7, you've got Judah still in existence, right? And there are opposing kings coming in who are going to destroy Judah. That seems to be what's going to happen. You have a wicked king on the throne of David, as often happens, unfortunately, in the Old Testament. And Isaiah goes to this king, to Ahaz, and God basically offers Ahaz to give him a sign. What kind of sign do you want? Because to confirm to you that I'm not going to abandon you, I'm going to protect you. Ahaz doesn't really want a sign. And so God says, you know what, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. This is in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. It says, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. It says, behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and will call his name Emmanuel, which means, like, God is with us. He will eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread, because these two kings are on the way, will be deserted. So God promises him, I'm going to give you a sign, Ahaz. A virgin will conceive and bear a son, and this son will be called Emmanuel. And before this boy is even a few years old, those kings that you dread, that are coming right now, that you think are going to destroy Judah, they're going to be brought to nothing. Now, as you read on, Isaiah himself actually goes into a woman, presumably a virgin, and she bears a son. And God tells Isaiah what to name the son, and what would you expect? Because this sounds like the fulfillment of that promise, right? You would expect he's going to call this son Emmanuel. But God says, go call your son Maher Shalal Hashbaz. All right, now is that the same thing as Emmanuel? That sounds odd, right? Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Well, turns out those two kings are brought to nothing. But God continues to threaten judgment against Judah if they keep rebelling against him. He's spared them here, delivered Ahaz from these two kings, but they're going to be judged if they keep rebelling. But then you come into Isaiah chapter 9, and this is the way Isaiah goes. There'll be promises of judgment, and then there'll be these scenes where there's going to be a day when there's going to be no more gloom, no more doom. This is Isaiah chapter 9. There'll be no gloom for her who was in anguish. Like Isaiah 9, verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, connected to Galilee of the nations in Isaiah 9:1. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. Isaiah suddenly predicts that there'll be restoration one day. But how will it happen? What is the path to that restoration? There'll be judgment and there'll be restoration, but how is this going to all happen? What's going to be the key for the turning from judgment to restoration? Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. I mean, think of that. The son that will be born, his name will be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And on the throne of David, and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with righteousness and justice from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And we ask, who is this son? And as you think, but wait a second, the people do go into exile, but yet God promises to raise up a son who's going to be called the Mighty God. And he's going to reign on the throne of David forever. So the exile must not be the end of the story, because God is guaranteeing to raise up a son to sit on the throne of David forever, as he's always been promising since the time of David. But then you think back, but what was that deal with that virgin conceiving and bearing a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us? Was Maher-shalal-hash-baz that son? It kind of seems like he was in some sense, because those two kings that Ahaz was dreading are brought to nothing during his life. But yet there's this son that's going to be raised up who's going to be called the Mighty God. And Emmanuel means God is with us. What is God planning to do? Is there more to this than what happens in Isaiah's day with Maher-shalal-hash-baz? Well, as you turn to Isaiah 10, it goes back to judgment. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. The people of Israel are going to be brought to very little. There's only going to be a few of them left. It'll be just a remnant that'll be saved of them. Just a small portion because of their rebellion against the Lord. It's like God is going to be chopping down the Davidic line. He's going to be chopping down the people of Israel. But then you come into Isaiah 11. And this is one of my favorite texts in the whole Bible. Isaiah chapter 11. There will come forth a shoot out of the stump of Jesse. Now, who's Jesse? That's David's dad. It's like Jesse's line, David's line, is going to be chopped down to the roots. There would just be a stump left. But there'll be a shoot that'll come forth out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will be on him. This one that will come up, a future son of David who will rise up, the Spirit of the Lord will be on him. Even if Jesse's line seems to be chopped down, God is completely committed to raise up from that stump a son, a future king. Verse 3, and his delight will be in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he'll kill the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. And look what will happen when this son of David, whose future beyond the exile, when he is raised up to reign in righteousness, what will happen? Isaiah 11 verse 6, in that day the wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. Verse 7, the cow and the bear will graze. Verse 8, the nursing child will play over the hole of the cobra. And the weaned child will put his hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, of him will the nations inquire, and his resting place will be glorious. You see, Isaiah knows judgment is coming, but on the other side, when it looks like the line of David has been completely destroyed, there'll be a shoot that'll come out of the stump of Jesse, and the son will rise to reign in righteousness. And when he reigns, there will be peace. He'll be the Prince of Peace. And things will be the way they were before. But they'll be even better, because this son of David will rule forever. And there'll be no more hurting, no more pain, no more sorrow. The Davidic king is coming. God has not rejected his promises. And when you read through the second half of Isaiah in particular, that son of David that God is going to raise up, God begins to refer to him in the second half of Isaiah as his servant, as the servant of the Lord. And if you read carefully through the text, what you find at the beginning of the second half of Isaiah is that the servant of the Lord seems to be Israel as a nation. But what you find is that Israel as a nation has failed. So God has determined to raise up one son from Israel to bring Israel back to him and to bring all the nations to him. And this is what you see like in a text like Isaiah chapter 49, where the servant actually speaks. And Isaiah 49 verse 5 says, now the Lord, so this is the servant speaking, it says, now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. He says in verse 6, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob or to bring back the preserved of Israel. This is the servant saying, God told me it's too small a thing for you to just bring Israel back to me. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Well, how will the servant be able to bring back not just sinful Israel, but the nations? You come to a text like in Isaiah 52 and 53, and you find out that this servant would be raised up by the Lord. He would be despised, Isaiah 53 verse 3, and rejected by men. He would be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He'd be the kind of guy from whom people would hide their faces. Why? I mean, this doesn't sound like someone who's going to rule the world. Why is he so despised and rejected? A man of sorrows, Isaiah 53 verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him, the servant, the son of David, was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. That is the story of the Old Testament. We've turned every one of us to his own way. And the Lord has laid on his faithful servant the sin of us all. Like, what does that mean? The servant that God will raise up to rescue and rule the world will be despised and rejected by us, and God himself will put our sins on his shoulders. What is God planning to do? It's like God's going to treat him like a lamb. You even find this in the text. He's going to be like a lamb, led to the slaughter. Like a sheep before its shears is silent, so this one will not open his mouth. How does this make sense? Verse 10, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. And yet as you read on in Isaiah 53, it's like this one will be crushed, but yet he will see his offspring. And through him, God will count many, many people righteous before him. And this is in some way how God is going to rescue the world, Israel, and the nations. How's it all going to fit? There is no clear answer to this in the Old Testament. But what you find in a book like Isaiah is that exile is not the end of the story. The destruction, the desolation of the throne of David, of the Davidic kingdom, is not the end of the story. God is completely committed to what he promised to his son David, to his servant David, the son of God in that sense. And God is committed to raise up a son of David, a son of God, who will one day sit on that throne again. But it won't be like it'll happen immediately, because it seems like that son is going to go through great suffering for us before there'll ever be that day when the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and when the kids will be playing with the cobras, when there'll be peace and no more pain and no more sorrow. It seems like the path will be for God to raise up a servant who's going to go through a lot of suffering before all things are made new. I wonder how that will turn out. This is how we leave our treatment of the Old Testament.